All right, we can get started. Before we dive into to Basecamp today, obviously want to welcome Dan Pink. Dan is a multiple five-time New York Times bestselling author. I think millions of copies of his books around the world, has done really just amazing work in spreading amazing messages and shining light in areas where kind of counterintuitive areas and findings of opportunity for a lot of people. So I'm excited to welcome Dan today, and I'm excited to welcome our members. I'm excited to welcome those of you that may be new to Madefor, and looking forward to this conversation. So with that, we will get started. So welcome, Dan, to Basecamp. Thank you for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me, Pat. Glad to be here.
I this is a conversation that I've been looking forward to for quite some time. I've always been a fan of your writing, and as I was reflecting back on some of the books that have resonated most with me, and then this latest book, The Power of Regret, I was trying to think about, what's the common denominator and why do I like your work so much? And the thing that I settled on was that you do such an amazing job of finding opportunity in unexpected places. And I just think it doesn't matter if you're talking about work or motivation or how to make decisions or how we connect. And in this case, the surprising science and benefits of what we would ordinarily think of as a negative emotion, this concept of regret, and maybe something that we should avoid, you instead shine a light on it and find an opportunity. So I'm just excited for this conversation and for the work you do. So thank you.
Well, thanks. I appreciate those. I appreciate those kind words, and I'm glad that someone is finding a common denominator in all those books because I don't know what it is.
Well, on that point, why did you write this book?
Um, I wrote it because I was curious about regret, in part because I had regrets and I was reckoning with them. Um, I, if there was a catalyst, it was my elder daughter's graduation from college in 2019, where I had this weird kind of out of body experience where I couldn't believe this kid. I mean, you mentioned your 1 year old. Just imagine, go forward in time 21 years when your 1 year old is graduating from college. And those 21 years, I mean, it started to sound like an old man, but those 21 years will be a blink of an eye. Truly, you will wake up one day and those 21 years will be over, and you'll say, "What the hell just happened?" And so I'm dead serious.
Many
And so
regrets
that's
in the
and so
process.
that happened to me. So I was, this young woman is walking across the stage in a cap and gown, graduating from college, and I'm like, "What? She was just born. How could this even possibly be?" Meanwhile, I'm having an out of body experience about myself because it's like, how the heck can I have a 22-year-old kid when I myself am only 27? And so as I was sort of having these kind of spinning thoughts, I started thinking about my own college experience, started thinking about my own regrets about college, even though I was generally pretty happy there. And what I found, Pat, is that when I came back and started just mentioning this very sheepishly to people, they leaned in. They leaned in a way that was surprising to me. When you have a topic, like you said before, that we often say, "Whoa, wait a second, regret, I don't want to go near this topic." And I found that interesting, counterintuitive. And as a writer, when people lean in to a conversation, that's a good sign. Because I've brought up many topics in my life where people did not have that reaction, where they began scanning for an exit. And so this was more promising.
Amazing, amazing. So you talk about this idea of let's spend less time celebrating the destination and more time contemplating on the journey. So I imagine graduation or birth of a child or getting married, we have these destinations or these maybe these markers in time
Yeah.
on life. But what you're saying is that if we can the journey and look back, that there's some surprising benefits to that, and specifically looking back on this negative emotion, something that we would traditionally avoid, or as you bring up in many different examples in your book, the idea of something that people champion as almost a metric of success. I have a tattoo that says no regrets, and that's how I live my life. But you say it's actually the exact opposite. Could you maybe expand on that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, you raise a lot in that. You raise a lot in that question. One of the things that I do think you make a very intriguing point about these markers in time. These markers in time, I think, inevitably encourage us to reflect or trigger us to reflect. There's some interesting work on what are known as temporal landmarks, where certain dates in the calendar trigger a way of thinking that is more reflective and more about new beginnings and whatnot. And there's also some interesting research showing that these markers cause a kind of reflection. And I think that the pandemic has been a marker like that. And so when we reflect, okay, so the very notion of reflection is you're looking backward. And when we look backward, there are things that we wish we didn't do. There are things that we wish we did do. There are decisions we made that we don't like. There are decisions we avoided that we wish we had actually embraced. And that's okay. In fact, that's very human. What the research tells us, and again, what this is my view about regret is not formed by any particular opinion that I have or any kind of innate political philosophy or anything that I have. It's informed by 50 years of science and some of my own research. And what 50 years of science tells us is two very distinct things. One, everybody has regrets. This idea that when someone says they have no regrets, they're either not telling the truth, or if they are telling the truth, they are in a small category of people. The only people without regrets are 5-year-olds. So if a 5-year-old tells me she doesn't have regrets, I believe her, because a 5-year-old's brain hasn't developed to the point where you can do the cognitive trapeze work that regret requires. It's incredibly cognitively sophisticated to think about the past and then jump back to the future. All right. If somebody with Parkinson's disease or a neurodegenerative disorder or brain lesions in the orbital frontal cortex says, I don't have regrets, I'm like, okay, great, because you have a diseased brain. If a sociopath tells me I don't have regrets, I say, well, that makes sense because you're a sociopath. But everybody else has regrets. It's one of the most common emotions that we have. It's arguably the most common negative emotion we have. And that's kind of interesting because you said at the top that it's a negative emotion. And you know what? It is. I don't like experiencing regret. I don't like feeling regret. It makes me feel bad, not good. So we have this puzzle. Why is this thing that makes us feel bad so ubiquitous? And the answer is pretty simple. Because it's useful if we treat it right. It's if we treat it right, and that's the big if. But if we treat it right, and if we get past this ridiculous, empty-headed, bullshitty notion that we should never have regrets, we can actually enlist this emotion as a powerfully transformative force.
It's amazing. And so if we seek out this emotion, or not necessarily seek it out, but if we take time to contemplate, to look at
exactly
what are those things that we regret, we're going to feel worse in the moment, but in feeling worse, we're going to inform some opportunity of how we can be better in the future.
Okay, that is so perfectly said. Okay, because you hit on an incredibly important point that I want to just underscore. I mean, you said it perfectly. I just want to actually just circle back, underline it, circle it, put stars around it, and highlight it. Which is this: that what regret does for us is that it clarifies what we value and it instructs us on how to do better. All right, and it makes us feel worse. But as you said very well, you can't have the clarity and the instruction without a little bit of the discomfort. You can't say, oh, I want the clarification about what I value and the instruction on how to do better, but I don't want to deal with the slight pain and discomfort. No, it comes together as a package, and that is essential to understand. And I think there's an even more profound point there, which is that I know that you studied positive psychology. And positive psychology, I think, is a great breakthrough in the intellectual history of behavioral science. However, an important move of the pendulum back toward human flourishing. But an aspect of human flourishing are negative emotions. We need some negative emotions. Negative emotions serve a purpose. Now, we want to have many more positive emotions than negative emotions. We want to feel, as Madefor talks about, we want to feel gratitude, for instance. We want to feel, in certain cases, awe. But negative emotions have their place. And the problem is that we have not been taught properly how to deal with negative emotions. So when we take this very common negative emotion like regret, what happens is we either ignore it, we put our fingers in our ears and say, blah, 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 I don't care about, or we wallow in it. We get overcome by it. And what we want to do is exactly what you say, which is, you use the word contemplate. We want to contemplate our regrets. We want to think about our regrets. We want to confront our regrets.
You mentioned some of the science and research that goes into your writing, and you're not only drawing from experts and studies that have been run. Just one top of mind, Sanja Lubomirsky.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm saying her last name correctly, but her research around if you spend 15 minutes a day contemplating something that you regret for a period of time, it's actually going to improve your overall sense of well-being and satisfaction. And the counterintuitive point here is that if you spend the same thing focusing on positive all the time, that is actually reducing the effects of that positive experience that you had.
Yeah, and in this, in the study that you're talking about in particular, it's hugely important and actually extremely important. And I was surprised by this myself, is that what she found is that if you write about positive experiences, writing about positive experiences, as you say, for 15 minutes a day, 3 days in a row, and writing about negative experiences has different effects. Well, they sort of have the same effect, but one you want and one you don't. So when we write about positive experiences for 15 minutes a day for three consecutive days, it actually makes the experience less positive. All right, so we'll come back to that. When we write about negative experiences for 15 minutes a day for 3 days, it makes the experience less negative. So writing about negative experiences is a good thing. Writing about positive experiences is a less good thing. Now, why is that the case? And the reason is this: that emotions, by their very nature, are amorphous. They're blobby. They're abstract. That's one of the things that makes positive emotions feel so good. All right. So for certain kinds of positive emotions, we just want to relish this. If you say, Dan, I would like you to write an essay explaining the 10 reasons why you love your family. And I'm like, okay, great. And I'm like at number 8, and I'm like, oh my God, I got to do 2 more. What, it's like, well, maybe I don't love my family that much. Whereas with negative emotions, what makes them menacing is their amorphousness. And by converting them into language, you, in some ways, defang them. You make them less menacing. You go from abstract to concrete. And that is itself helpful, and it also begins a sense-making process. And so, once again, I think at a broad level here is that if we're concerned about human flourishing, like you are and like the whole Madefor team is, we want to actually help people understand the place of negative emotions in their lives and how to contend with them.
I love it. I love it. And we're gonna come back to this. We're gonna come back to the 3-step process and how we face regret. So I skipped ahead a little bit, but I thought that was an interesting point. I want to come back a little bit, touch on one point, and then I want to talk about the research that you did, because you ran 2 massive research studies to inform the writing, and I want to get to some of the takeaways from that. But the first thing that I want to talk about, and I think this was top of mind for me when I first heard the topic of the book and was thinking about regret, is the difference between disappointment and regret. Because there are a lot of things in my life that have happened that, man, I wish they hadn't gone that way. And I could sense myself getting to this place where I regret that, that thing happened overseas, or that thing happened on that operation, or this thing. But you make a really important point in distinction between disappointment and regret. I'm wondering if you could share that.
Sure. The biggest difference between disappointment and regret is agency. All right. Regret is your fault. Disappointment is not your fault. Disappointment is external forces. So there are all kinds of examples of this. So you and I are talking. You and I are talking in the midst of March Madness. All right. And I happen to be I'm a son of the Big Ten. I am a graduate of Northwestern. You can see right now I'm wearing my Northwestern sweatshirt. All right. I cannot regret that Northwestern was not in the March Madness. Okay. I'm disappointed, but I can't regret it because I don't play. I don't coach. It's like it's outside of my hands. I'll give you the best example though. Is Janet Landman formerly at University of Michigan, and one of the early researchers in sort of the psychology and philosophy of regret, had this great thing. She tells a story of a 6-year-old girl who loses a tooth, one of her first teeth. So at night, the girl puts the lost tooth under her pillow for the tooth fairy. She wakes up the next morning, she takes away the pillow. Oh my gosh, the tooth is still there. She's disappointed, but her parents regret that they didn't replace the tooth with $1. So that's all about agency.
Love it. Love it. So you have to have agency to have regret. You have to have some semblance of control on whatever the outcome is, a decision in the process in order to have regret. So you ran these two big research studies. Could you tell us a little bit about that and your
Yep,
findings? And
happily.
because I think it's fascinating.
Sure. So I did two. And a way to think about them is one is quantitative, one is qualitative. So the quantitative one, the numerical one, was something I call the American Regret Project. It was a giant public opinion survey, the largest public opinion survey of American attitudes about regret ever conducted. We worked with the data analytics. We surveyed 4,489 Americans. We oversampled so that we could forgive me for getting the weeds, that we could weight the WIGHT, weight the sample, so we can make conclusions about demographic differences in regret. So that was one thing that I did. The second thing that I did was something called the World Regret Survey, which was qualitative. It's a giant collection tool where we asked people around the world, tell us about one of your big regrets. And we now have a lot of regrets now. We now have close to 20,000 regrets from people in 109 countries. And that proved very interesting too. And each of those allowed me to make derive different kinds of insights, I guess.
And so you talk about this that you on one, and I can't imagine doing this, but you read every single one of those responses.
The first 15,000. I didn't, the ones that have come in. Yeah.
Okay, not the last 5,000, but the first 15,000. And you talk about, and typically we think about regrets across these various domains of life that everyone have, whether it's work or family or professional or personal or whatever the domain may be. But you illuminated an interesting something deeper that was going on beneath the surface, and ultimately settled on these real four main categories of regret, and you go on to talk about why those four categories are important and how we should think about regrets moving forward. So could you maybe talk about the deep structure that you uncovered through this process?
Sure. What I found in the quantitative side, the public opinion poll, when I asked people their regrets, and I had them slot them into categories: career, education, romance, family, finance, those kinds of things. And what I found is actually what other researchers had found, which is that people's regrets are all over the place. You can't find a clear pattern in what people regret. But it turned out that I was sort of asking the wrong question and looking for the answer in the wrong place. And that's what the qualitative piece of research told me. And this is actually why that painstaking process of reading through those 15,000 regrets was actually useful. What I found in reading through those regrets were, as you say, sort of four core kinds of regrets that ran underneath the domains of life. Let me be less abstract and tell you what I mean by that. So I have in that giant database of now almost 20,000 regrets, a lot of regrets about people who say, okay, this is not a major, but a decent number, dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of American college graduates who regret not studying abroad. I have a lot of regrets about, a surprising number of regrets about that. So I went to college, I had a chance to study abroad, but I didn't do it, now I regret it. Okay, that's an education regret. Then I have, on this one I got hundreds of regrets that go basically like this. X years ago, there was a man/woman who I really liked. I wanted to ask her out on a date, but I was too chicken to, and I've regretted it ever since. All right, that's a romance regret. Then I have lots, once again, in the hundreds of regrets around the world. I wanted to start a business, I wanted to be an entrepreneur, I wanted to go out on my own, but I was too chicken to do it, and I've stayed in this lackluster job. That's a career regret. But those are all the same regret in my view. That's the regret of if only I'd taken a chance. If only I'd taken the chance. And it doesn't matter the domain. It doesn't matter whether it's travel or romance or business or whatever. You're at a juncture in your life. You can play it safe. You can take the chance. And over again, people regret not taking the chance. Now, that's not true for every single person, but it's pretty overwhelming that the volume of regrets about chances not taken causes this lingering kind of regret. So boldness regrets are one category of regret. Another one, I'll just go through them quickly, are foundation regrets. Foundation regrets are if only I'd done the work. These are regrets where people make small decisions early in their life that, no single one is horrible, but they accumulate and they have pretty nasty effects overall. So these are things, okay, so the biggest one was people who saved too little and spent too much. So I didn't save enough money. I spent too much money. A lot of health related ones, especially outside the United States, like smoking outside of the United States was a big one. I didn't take care of my body. I didn't take care of my mind and brain. I didn't work hard enough in school. So that's foundation regrets. Third one, moral regrets. If only I'd done the right thing. These are people who regret various kinds of moral transgressions, predominantly things like bullying, marital infidelity, basically harm and cheating were the biggest categories within there. And then finally, our connection regrets, which are if only I'd reached out. These are regrets about relationships, not so much about romantic relationships, but about the full sort of universe of relationships that we have, that often will come apart, and people say, oh, I should reach out, but it's going to be awkward, and they're not going to care, so they don't, and then it gets more awkward, and they don't again, and then sometimes it's too late. So those are the four. Just to recap very quickly: foundation regrets, if only I'd taken the chance. Boldness regrets, foundation regrets, if only I'd done the work. Boldness regrets, if only I'd taken the chance. Moral regrets, if only I'd done the right thing. And connection regrets, if only I'd reached out.
Some of the things that stood out to me, I just want to go through each of these one by one.
Sure.
and highlight some things that I found really interesting. So on foundation regrets, you talk about this idea of temporal discounting, that we favor the present over the future, and that's how we make our decisions. And so and you make the distinction that, look, those foundation regrets, part of those we have agency in, part of those that we don't, right? And so if someone doesn't have access to education or doesn't have the resource to pursue professional opportunities, that can impart some structural foundational issues at a later stage in life, but maybe you did or did not have an ability to affect that. But I think the one thing that you stated here that I think is really important, so it doesn't matter what stage of life you're at or what your foundation looks like, is you cited this proverb that I think is really profound and applicable. And I'm wondering if you could share that, if you remember it, if not.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting that you pick up on that. So one of the I'll answer your question directly, but let me, as is my custom, offer a lengthy preamble. The thing is, so if you have a regret about, say, taking crappy care of your body or brain for 20 years, you can't correct that right away. I mean, you can't do that. If you have a regret, as many people did, about not saving money, and suddenly the instead of getting the benefits of compounding interest, you're getting the dark side of compounding interest, you can't change that immediately. But what you can do is, again, to the proverb, which is this, is that the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time to plant a tree is today. And so when we reckon with our foundation regrets, it gives us, I think, the impetus to start doing things better today. It's not going to correct the problem fully, but it's going to get us on the road. This is not my line, but I love the sentiments here, and it ties very, very closely to this, is that you can't change your location in a day, but you can change your trajectory. And so totally,
those small
that's
actions,
a nice way to put
forward, can make a big difference. So, okay, foundation regrets. And then boldness regrets. I think this is something that I also found fascinating, that we regret inaction more than we do action. That to me seems surprising. It's not, we look back
really?
And we say, yeah, I would think so. Like if I know what I did wrong, I would think that I would regret those decisions more so than the things that I didn't do. After reading the book, I now feel differently, but I don't know. I found that really interesting and surprising.
Yeah, it's a very sturdy finding.
Yeah.
It's something that I got in my quantitative survey very robustly, and in a big age effect. That is, when we're young, we tend to have equal numbers of regrets of action and inaction, regrets about what we did and regrets about what we didn't do. But as we age, not even close. The inaction regrets take over. We can speculate the reasons for that, but it's a very strong finding.
Yeah, you laid a very clear case for it in the book, and I think the best way that you framed it is that if the foundation regrets are about building a solid foundation so that you can explore and do other things, the boldness regrets are about not taking advantage of the foundation that you built. And so it doesn't matter what foundation you have, taking advantage of that and getting into action for opportunities is what that is all about. So fascinating. The moral regret category, I think this is one that obviously probably resonates with everyone. But the fact that the duration and the effects of the moral decisions were the ones that lasted the longest, I think speaks says something about humans and maybe the way that we're designed. I'm curious if you could maybe talk about that.
Well, I mean, I think it does. I mean, if I think of the number of people I have here. There's one woman in the book. I think she's like 71 or something like that, and she has a regret about stealing candy from a grocery store when she was 10, 60 years ago. I had a woman who I interviewed who had a regret about bullying when she was 10, and this woman was in her 50s, and I was interviewing her via Zoom, and she broke into tears talking about this. So. These moral regrets stick with people, and as you suggest, it might be a good thing. I mean, it might be heartening in the sense that what it suggests is that most of us want to be good. Most of us want to do the right thing. Most of us want to be good, and that when we veer from that, we feel bad. And that at some level we are. I mean, I hate to use this word, but at some level, I think that we are wired for morality, that we are wired to do the right thing, and
that's a great thing.
and yeah, I mean, the word wired is always fraught in that sense, but you get the idea. I mean, you can put it in another way. Where, there is probably an evolutionary advantage to being a moral person, to being trustworthy, to doing the right thing, because you're more likely to have people around you who will support you, who will take care of you, who will reciprocate, et cetera, et cetera. But my belief, forged by these evidence, is that nearly all of us want to do the right thing and feel bad when we don't.
Mm-hmm. That's a good finding, I think. We had Lisa Feldman Barrett on a few months ago, and Lisa talks about that we are social creatures, and another human is required, that we have to have the participation of someone else to effectively regulate our nervous systems. That is a reciprocal process that goes back and forth. And so I think that ties to this last bucket, and what
good point. Yeah.
Maybe I think I found surprising, but that this was the largest bucket of regret, which is that of connection. Yeah. And I'm wondering maybe if you could maybe talk about the Grant study and the central finding there, and then how that might apply to this bucket.
Well, the Grant study was a famous piece of research in psychological science that was I think it's still the largest longitudinal study ever done, where they began investigating. It was all, at the beginning it was all men who were at Harvard, so it's all men, all white. So, but they followed them through their lives in pretty invasive ways. Constant, measuring many physiological things, measuring their overall sense of well-being to see who flourished and who floundered. And what it came down to ultimately, basically, who was happy and who wasn't, was actually relatively simple. After following these men for, I think in some cases 70 years, the people who had loving relationships were happy, and the people who didn't were not. And all these other things, external measures of success, money, material goods, professional accomplishments, didn't matter much at all. In fact, the guy who ran the study for about a 50-year period said, I can summarize the results in 5 words: happiness is love, full stop.
That's it. And love is connection.
Well, yeah, connection. I think connection is love. That's an interesting point, because I think that when we think about that word love, I think sometimes our thoughts immediately go to romantic love, which is obviously extremely important in our lives. But one of the things that I took away from this, and hearing all these connection regrets, where people had regrets about, basically, as I said before, it's people who has a relationship that comes apart, and they usually come apart in these profoundly undramatic ways. They drift apart. They don't explode. And people don't reach out because they're skittish, but the relationships are parents and kids and siblings, but also especially friends and colleagues and ex-colleagues and things like that. And I think that what we should be thinking about with love is expanding our notion of love more beyond simply romantic love. That there, you know, again, that's not a novel idea, but to me, it's an urgent idea, because what people need in their lives is that kind of love more than, I mean, believe me, I'm all for romantic love, right? But we need romantic love and another kind of love. And so, you know, I was thinking, I felt this very personally with this research, because hearing these stories about friendships and friendships that have drifted apart, I have a cluster of close friends, and you know, I'm realizing like I love these people. You know, I don't love them the way I love my wife, but I love them, and that's an important part of my life, and we should name it that. You know, that at some level we love our friends. Certain, you know, not all of them, but we love, you know, a lot. We love people in our lives, beyond simply our spouse and our, if we have one, and our, you know, romantic partner, and our kids if we have them.
Power of connection, something we talk a lot about. So we have now the benefit of the collective wisdom of 20,000 people that have participated in your study, in your survey, and we've seen signals, or you've highlighted clear signals around there are these four major categories of regret: foundation, boldness, moral, connection. And I think you make a really interesting argument that there's a spectrum that you could fall on here. One would be that you live a life of no regrets and maybe blissful ignorance, and or maybe you have brain damage. On the other end of the spectrum is that you're in a constant state of rumination around your regrets, and
Yeah.
neither are healthy, neither are helpful.
Right.
And so it's about finding what that right set point is. And I think you make a case that, like, look, at the end of the day, think about these four categories, focus on those four categories of regrets, and ignore the rest of them. And if you can focus on these four, mind these four, contemplate it around these, that can inform how you move forward, and therein lies the opportunity. So as a way to simplify it, and so I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that's what I took away from it. And then we come from that into, okay, so I've identified some regrets. What do I do now? What's the process? And I think you highlight a very clear and simple, actionable process that we can all engage in. And I'm wondering, maybe we talk about that now.
Sure. So this is how we deal with our retrospective regrets. And so for certain kinds of regrets, we can undo them. So if we've hurt somebody, we can try to make amends, we can apologize. Certain kinds of action regrets, we can actually take some of the sting out of it and make them and make it less likely that we begin that march toward rumination. So I have a lot of people in that giant database. I think it's like all women but it's a common regret, which is, I shouldn't have married that idiot. I regret marrying that idiot, but at least I have these two great kids. That is, they find a silver lining, and that can be psychologically healthy. But in terms of remember, to your earlier point, which is important, the only way to do better is to feel worse. All right, so that the regret makes us feel bad, but it helps us do better, and those two things are integrally connected. So what do you do with that negative feeling? So I look at it as three, sort of refined it a little bit. Look at it as three steps: inward, outward, forward. Inward, outward, forward. Inward, outward, forward. So inward is how you investigate yourself, how you look at yourself and your regret. So, and one of the things that you see, and I know that Madefor has done some work on self-compassion as well, but one of the things you see is when we talk to ourselves, our internal dialogue, the way we talk to ourselves is brutal, it's cruel, it's vicious, it's ridiculous. That if you, I mean, I'll say that I don't mean that to criticize the people here. I'll testify to myself. If you were to attach like an electrode to my brain that would broadcast my self-talk out into the world, you would think I was a freaking lunatic. If I talk to other people in the workplace the way I talk to myself, I would be fired. And so the remedy there is, don't do that. Instead, treat yourself with self-compassion. And what that means is basically treat yourself and your regrets with kindness rather than contempt. Now that sounds a little gooey, but there's 20 years of research showing that it's the effective approach. That self-esteem can be kind of vacuous. Self-criticism, it feels morally virtuous to some of us, but there's not a lot of evidence that it's effective. What's more effective is self-compassion. Treat yourself with kindness rather than contempt. Recognize that your missteps and mistakes are part of the human condition. So that's one, inward. Outward.
And self-compassion isn't necessarily giving you an out for bad behavior.
Not at all.
Right.
Not at all. In fact, I'm glad you mentioned that. And again, so I encourage you, for folks who want to read more about this, is look at the work of Kristen Neff. The benefits are massive, but the thing is like you say, oh, if you treat myself with self-compassion, I'm going to become complacent. No, the research doesn't say that. The research does say versions of that with self-esteem, which is simply making yourself feel good about yourself. All right. Self-compassion is actually treating yourself with kindness about your missteps. Self-esteem is saying, I'm great anyway. I make mistakes, but I'm awesome anyway. And what some of the research on self-esteem shows is self-esteem isn't all bad, but what the research on self-esteem shows is that it can get people to not try as hard because they don't want to risk injuring their self-esteem. So treat yourself with kindness rather than contempt. Next step, which we talked a little bit about, is outward. There's something to be said for disclosure, depending on your comfort level. Now, it's not an act. We can gain insight from the fact that 20,000 people decided to share their biggest regret with a complete stranger. That itself tells us something. Before we even get to the content of those 20,000 regrets, the mere fact that 20,000 people wanted to reveal that tells us something. What it tells us is that disclosure is a form of unburdening. And as we were talking about before, when we convert our regrets, blobby, amorphous, painful, menacing, into concrete words, they're less menacing and we can make sense of them. So that's outward. And the final step, which is super important, it's essential here. And I think it pairs really well with both of these, is that you have to extract a lesson from it. That's the outward. You have to extract a lesson from it. And we tend to stink at solving our own problems. We're better at solving other people's problems. So the technique of self-distancing, taking a step back, is often very powerful. So you can do things like, there are goofy things like talk to yourself in the third person, which is, there are a lot of evidence is effective. I actually do that a lot with exercise. Like once I read that research, when I exercise or run or whatever, I no longer say, I can do it. I say, come on, Dan, you can do this. And so talk to your third person. I think that the single best decision-making heuristic that I know is, if you're faced with a decision about what to do, ask yourself, what would you tell your best friend to do? And people almost always know. So again, treat yourself with compassion, with self-compassion, kindness rather than contempt. Disclose, convert to language to make sense of it, and then take a step back to draw a lesson from it. And it's very simple. The problem is no one ever teaches us how to do it. And once you do it a few times, it becomes effortless, essentially, and it becomes like a habit, essentially. And it's a habit that allows us to take this negative emotion and transmute it into something positive.
It's amazing. It very, very much aligns with, a lot of what we talk about in this idea of how can you reflexively move through your day better, move through challenges or friction, right. And how can you be your own best teammate, extend yourself, have your default be one of giving yourself grace and, recognizing that life is hard, life gets a vote, and yeah. and you're going to get knocked off course, but how you bring yourself back on is, you do that by being your own best teammate. That's going to set you up for success. The disclosure thing, I think, is fascinating because we've talked a lot in the past around what happens when you put pen to paper, and that it forces you to organize and integrate your thoughts in a way that otherwise just might seem too abstract or not something that you can put down and then see, and let me analyze this and action off of it. So I really like this. Yeah. And it fits. I guess it goes back to the larger point, which you make really well in the book, is that, look, regret slows us down so that we can see opportunities. And if we're not taking a chance to slow down, putting pen to paper, disclosing those regrets, then we miss out on opportunities. And I'd never heard this phrase before, but you talk about this, that it helps us avoid an escalation of commitment to a failing course of action, which to me, I get so many visions in my mind of, operations or training scenarios from the military where people just keep doubling down and chasing sunk costs because they don't take the benefit of pausing for a second, slowing down and seeing, is there a better way? So So disclosure, and then ultimately the distancing, pulling back so you can have perspective, and then cultivate wisdom that can inform how you move forward. And we had Ethan Cross on a few months ago. So Ethan, for those of you that haven't had a chance to listen to that, check that out. Ethan talks extensively about rumination, and he calls this concept of chatter, how sometimes we can be our own worst enemy, but how distancing or creating a little bit of distance between that chatter and ourselves, in there's opportunity. So very cool. Okay. All right. So we've got these 4 categories. We have these 3 steps that we follow. You touch on something towards the end that I also found really interesting, and something we've talked about, Dan McAdams' work around the power of narrative, and that and its applicability to, the story we tell ourselves about our regrets or our lives. I'm wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about that.
Well, sure. Dan McAdams is a personality psychologist at Northwestern, and as you say, he sort of has a theory of personality that is rooted in narrative. That is essentially that our lives are narratives, that are the way we fashion who ourselves essentially is by telling a story about ourselves. And he says there are 2 reigning stories that people tell. One is what he calls a contamination story, where things go from good to bad. And then the other one is a redemption story, where things go from bad to good. And it seems that the psychologically healthy approach is the redemption story, to see your life as a story of redemption, where you're going from, bad to good, or from not as good to better, that you're making progress, that you're redeeming your promise. And I find that very powerful. And I think that regret offers a kind of a redemption narrative, that instead of saying, and I think that wallowing is in some ways a contamination narrative. It's like, everything was perfect until the snake got into the Garden of Eden of my life and contaminated everything because I made a bad decision, and now everything's gone terrible on me. Whereas if you say, I made a mistake, I made a bad decision, I didn't do something that I wanted to do, what have I learned from that? You go from bad to good, and you redeem yourself. You redeem at some level your entire life.
Wow. The power of the personal narrative, and the fact that we have agency in that process. We
do.
It reminds
we have some
me
agency.
Yeah.
And that's the thing about this is an interesting point, because I think that one of the things about when you, and this is something that I was trying to work out, is that when you see your life as a narrative. So we'll stipulate our lives are a narrative. So, but in that narrative, are we the character or are we the author? And the answer is yes, we're both. And that's actually part of understanding. It's like with your point, life gets a vote, all right? It's like we have some control, but not fully. We're at the mercy of circumstance, but not fully either. And that in some ways, a healthy life is teasing out what do we have control over and what do we don't.
Yeah. Control is something that we talk a lot about here in agency. And I think as it relates to the narrative, have you heard of the Challenger study before? I'm just using Challenger to frame it. It's oftentimes called that, but it's something that we've talked about in the past, that it was the study done, I believe, in the 80s, where a researcher took all of his students immediately post the crash of the Challenger and said, "Where were you? How did you view the Challenger space shuttle explosion?" And so everyone wrote down their where they were, all the details, and then he revisited those same students a period of time later, years later, and said, "Where were you? What did you do?" And everyone, "Oh yeah, I remember. I got exactly where I was," and wrote all the specifics and exhausting detail about where they were, how they witnessed it, and what the scenario was. And what they found was that the vast majority of the people were completely wrong. They weren't even close in terms of what they initially self-reported. And so I think what the opportunity that presents for us, I think if someone is struggling around regret or the narrative side of things, is like, hey, chances are you don't have it perfectly correct. Like you don't remember, your recall is not perfect. And so therein also lies an opportunity. You get to decide what story you want to tell yourself. So anyways, I thought that it was interesting and applicable. So I think, at a high level, to zoom out a little bit, and these are your words, not mine, but you talk about that regrets by and large aggravate. They make us feel worse. They they put us in a place of adversity or friction. But productive regrets not only aggravate, they also activate. So they tell us what we do going forward, and in that we can get a surprising amount of benefits.
Right. And at some level, that's something where we do have some agency.
Yeah.
That is, we can, when we feel that aggravation, we can say, I'm ignoring that. I don't feel anything. What elephant in the room, right? You can do that. That leads to delusion. Or you can say, oh my God, aggravation. I can't deal with aggravation. This is the worst thing in the world, and be completely debilitated by that. Or you can say, okay, aggravation, time to activate. And I think that's, and again, I do feel like we have, except at maybe sort of some of the extremes where rumination is a medical issue, dealing with excessive medical anxiety or depression or something like that. But for things that aren't there, which I think is the majority of the human condition, we can learn how to do that. We have some agency. We can use that aggravation in order to activate ourselves. We just need to know how. And we also need to know that it's okay, that when I feel aggravation, when you feel aggravation, I feel aggravation, it's because we're human. We're not that special. Everyone's dealing with this.
Yeah. Wow. I as an exercise after reading the book and before recording this, I went through and I said, all right, because I find that I'm always focusing forward. What's the next thing? What's the next mission? What are we working towards? And trying to understand what I can control, ignore what I can't. And I don't spend a lot of time looking backwards. But your book and your work and your research forced me to put pen to paper and say, okay, well, all right, if you don't think you have regrets, like let's test this out. And so I just wrote down the 4 categories: foundation and boldness, moral, connection. And then I forced myself to take inventory and reflect on, like, all right, what is something within each of those categories that I regret? And it took time. I had to sit with it for a little while, but I was able to, as anyone that lives life or as alive is able to do, I was able to hone in on some. And then you had said something that I think is just a perfect encapsulation of all this, and that our regrets are almost and I think I'm using this correctly, but a photographic negative of what we value. And so in having that image in mind, I said, I already listed out my categories, my regrets, and then I tried to understand, what do those regrets signal about what I value, and how does what I value decide where I want to go next? And I found it to be an incredibly powerful exercise that, frankly, you shine the light on it and made accessible. So, yeah, I don't know if that's
great. No, that's fantastic. That's the whole point of writing. That's the whole point of my writing this book, was actually to get people to rethink, reclaim, reframe this emotion and use its power. Use its power for good. Don't as I keep saying, don't ignore it. Don't wallow in it. Use it as a signal. And when we use it as a signal, that itself is an act of courage. One of the things that irritates me is that when people say no regrets as a form of sort of performative courage. Oh, look how courageous I am. I don't have any regrets. I never look backward. And that's not courage. Courage is looking your regrets in the eye and doing something about them. That's what real courage is.
I love it. So powerful. And that courage manifests in ways big and small. They don't have to be big actions in order to be courageous. That's sometimes the smallest way. Yeah.
Absolutely. And again, just going back to the central point, which is that to one of the things you just said a moment ago, regret clarifies. It clarifies what matters to us. And around the world, like, the things that matter to us is, do I have some stability? Am I able to not throw away my limited time on this planet and do something interesting and big and meaningful? Am I doing the right thing? And do I have people who love me and who I love? And that's it. And so it clarifies what we value, but it also instructs us on how to do better. And so it ends up being, it ends up being a surprisingly, almost kind of shockingly transformative emotion if we deal with it right.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Dan, how do you think about someone that maybe has experienced a lot of trauma, or how do you view trauma, historical life trauma, and then how that interacts with being able to use regret for growth versus getting stuck. Is
Yeah,
that is
yeah.
that is that
There's
something
some
that you've?
there's some work on this, and it is. I mean, I encourage you. I don't know it very well, but there's some interesting things about where people who experience basically similar comparable levels of trauma end up on very different trajectories. And so we all know about post-traumatic stress, which is a medical ailment, but there's also something called post-traumatic growth, where the trauma actually ends up being enhancing. And I actually don't know all the factors that go into post-traumatic growth. Some of it I think has to deal with perhaps some innate personal characteristics. But I think some of it also has to do with the way that we frame the trauma. Um, Not entirely. Okay, I don't want to go too far, but how we frame the trauma. And we see it. This trauma is a test. It's a test of my resilience. It's a test of my creativity. It's a test of my perseverance. That this trauma doesn't fully define my life. It is a moment in my life. That this trauma is essentially that this trauma is something where I didn't have the agency. I didn't bring this on myself. I'm not to blame for this. But so I have no control over that. What I do have some control over is how I react to it. And so, but trauma is less common and obviously more intense and more significant than a mere regret.
We'll
But
do
but the thing is, I do think that in some level, and this is I had this experience where I had a reporter call me. Well, I don't know, maybe like 18 months into the pandemic, and she was doing a story on, what are going to be the lasting implications of this pandemic. And one of the things that I said is like, we shouldn't overstate the pessimistic side of this, that everyone's going to be completely brought down, that it's going to change things for the worse, that we're going to have massive problems and people are going to spend years digging out of the psychological consequences of this. And I was saying, well, I actually think that one of the things that it will show us is how resilient we are, and that we tend to underestimate human resilience over and over and over again, which is clearly not the answer that you wanted to hear.
That's an answer I love, though, and obviously you never want to minimize someone's experience, and there's very real.
Not at all.
factors.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly right. Exactly right. Exactly right. Because it's. I mean, you think about it. It's not quite as a bell curve, but let's just call it like there's a distribution. And at some parts of the distribution, it's horrible. It is a medical problem. It is awful. People need help. They need comfort. They need care. They need some kind of rehabilitation. There's no question about that. But that's not true for everybody.
Yeah.
And I think that I think this goes back to what we were talking about before, which is, and you see it in some ways with young people, is that I think young people are being brought down psychologically, in part because they haven't been taught how to deal with negative emotions. And so when they experience a negative emotion, they think somehow they're singular, they're unique, they're broken because everyone else is leading such a positive life. And the answer to that is not to medicalize every one of those situations or to give everybody a counselor. The goal is to help people understand that negative emotions are an integral part of their life, and knowing how to deal with them and use them to your benefit is an important source of human flourishing.
Man, exclamation mark. I mean, I think that's it. You captured so many things so well there. The opportunity with around something that, again, on the surface seems negative, but when we engage it and we choose to face it and we face a little bit of friction or adversity, that it can be incredibly informative, and not only informative but enriching in our lives. And that there is no positive without a negative. And so that's awesome. Well, we're almost up on time here. I want to ask: is there anything that you feel like we haven't covered that we should cover, or are there any insights that you've gleaned you've gleaned since releasing this book out and talking with people, or any final takeaways that you'd like to leave people with?
I think that the most important thing that we can do in our lives is to actually talk to other people about our regrets. Regret still needs to be normalized. It is profoundly normal and human, except that it isn't kind of culturally normalized yet. And the way that it becomes normalized in the broader culture is not by me, saying normalize regret. It comes from people in their day-to-day interactions with their partners, with their kids, with their colleagues, saying, you know what, I regret, blah, 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 blah. Here's what I learned from it, and here's what I'm going to do about it. So the more we disclose our regrets, say what we learned, and then tell us what we're going to do differently, the more I think that we'll start normalizing this regret, and that itself is going to have a kind of a buoyant effect on people's well-being.
Man, I love that. That in that vulnerability, there's opportunity, and maybe therein lies where courage comes back into this. So if you can have the courage to be vulnerable, to lean into those regrets and share them, you normalize it for everyone else, and in the process, lift them up and yourself up. And that's something that we talk a lot about. In that a better world really does begin with the best you, but you have to have the courage, the conviction, the confidence to take action and bring out the best in yourself to bring out the best in others. So, Dan, this has been an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for just shining a light on this and putting forth such a great book, but two, spending time with us today to talk about it.
Total pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, everyone. Dan, look forward to the next book, and take care, everyone. We'll see you all soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Cheers.